Thank you so much. Over the last 2 days, 2.5 days, we've been talking about how to have this transition in the transport sector, and I think everybody underscored the importance of charging infrastructure. I think we all understand that now it's not a chicken and egg problem anymore. The importance of having enough charging infrastructure in place is extremely crucial for this transition in the transport sector. So that's what I'll be focusing on in my presentation today. I'll start off with setting a base to talk about how big is this market, what constitutes when we say EV charging infrastructure. Is it the hardware, or are there more elements beyond hardware included in this? So we'll basically set the base by looking at what is the global market size of EV charging infrastructure. And then we'll take a look at the snapshot of the current EVCI market in the region. So kind of a quick comparison, so to speak. And then towards the end, we'll focus on the key lessons learned from the established markets, which are definitely more advanced than this region, and then how can we learn from those mistakes which were made in terms of putting the charging infrastructure in place, the pace at which it was introduced, and how can this be sort of addressed here already as we move towards EVs in this region. Starting off with that base of global market of EV charging infrastructure, you'll see that we're looking at multiple scenarios until 2030, and there are multiple reasons for that. And that can be explained by looking at the market drivers here. We talked about a lot of initiatives which are driving this market. A lot of countries have set a goalpost, kind of a target for themselves, not only in the form of EVs, but also EV charging infrastructure. Oftentimes, they're very much correlated that, this many EVs by 2030, or maybe that's the percentage of sale of vehicles that would like to electrify by 2030 or 2035, and the corresponding target for the EV charging infrastructure. Those targets do change, have changed in the recent past. In some countries, it was a reality check as well. Some feedback coming from the supply side that, hey, this is an unrealistic target, so that's why these goals and targets, they have changed. So that's why you see some scenarios in place. Other factors are the pricing, because when we look at the revenue, we have to look at the pricing of the charging infrastructure and beyond. So that's why you see a range of scenarios here. But the one in the middle, where we anticipate this market to be touching $50 billion by the end of this decade, that's the most realistic one. That's the one where if the current incentives stay in place and the current momentum kind of continues and there are no major disruptions. I mean, to give you an example, in the US, it's election year. A lot of the incentives were introduced by the current government, so there can be changes towards the end of the year if the political landscape changes. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see that it's not just the hardware. So hardware includes the charging infrastructure itself, the cables, but on top of it, we are also looking at the software market. So this includes all the features included in the charging infrastructure, so such as demand response, payment mechanism, remote management. All of that comes from the software market on top of the hardware. And then there is another area, which is the EV charging infrastructure services market. So this includes installation and commissioning of EV chargers. It also includes retrofitting. So in many cases, we've seen that countries which had existing infrastructure in place, they wanted to upgrade it to higher capacity. So this is also included in the services market. So yeah, with this, we have kind of a base to see that what's the total opportunity out there when it comes to EV charging infrastructure, also split by hardware, software, and services. And we're looking at somewhere between 40 to 60 billion USD by the end of the decade. Next, looking at some of the incentives and policies, some of them which are kind of driving this. So this includes those goals and targets that I talked about earlier. Many countries have set for themselves in terms of the sales of the EVs, in terms of the number of charging points. As I said, in many cases, they are very, very heavily mathematically coupled, so to speak. They're correlated with each other, because one of the metric that in many cases one looks at, what's the ratio between EVs on the road versus the DC charge points. Is it 20 vehicles to one charge point, 30? So it varies. It can vary if a country is heavily reliant on residential charging infrastructure, for example. In case of US, as you can see, the minimum 35%, this was different. A few months ago, this was different. This was 50% by 2030, so this changed. And the recent slowdown actually in the US is kind of one factor behind it. So now there is a range that the US will aim for 35% to 55% electrification. 35% minimum is the target set. So this changed. UK changed its targets as well. And as I said, it was kind of an iteration. Everybody had some feedback coming from the supply side as well that, hey, we need to kind of readjust some of the targets. But the bottom line is, these are the targets which are kind of driving the total market that we saw in the previous slide as well. All right, so with this, we can take a quick look at the current status of the market in the region here. UAE is definitely leading in terms of the EVs as well as the charging infrastructure, so that's amazing to see. But of course, if we look at, we compare the infrastructure in place, there is a long way to go from this point onward. Very similar to this, we already see some movement, as we saw in the global scale, that we had these targets and goals set. A lot is happening in the region as well, in terms of both electrification of the passenger vehicles. We just had a discussion on the commercial vehicles as well, but of course, as we saw that it trickles from the passenger vehicles segment to commercial vehicles and beyond, even in the maritime industry and aviation to some extent. So it kind of trickles from there. So the momentum needs to happen in the passenger vehicle electrification. So we see that there are goals being defined, which is amazing to see, because I think that's the first important aspect, and that leads to setting the goals for the EV charging infrastructure as well. You don't see much about UAE because I had a couple of slides on UAE. We see clear targets, the amount of investment that needs to go in. We had some discussion in the previous sessions as well that there are policies being put in place to make sure that this momentum actually kicks in, which I discussed in the first slide as well, that having this momentum kind of injected from the outside is extremely important in all sectors, including passenger vehicle electrification. This plan of 70,000 charging points, I think that's going to be very pivotal to have in the country by 2030. That sets the tone for everybody else as well. And then some other great initiatives going on as well. So this EV Green Charger initiative by DEWA, I think that's also an amazing initiative. And then a lot of regulatory framework being put in place. As I said, this is the first step that needs to happen for any change in this market. In the next few minutes, I'd like to focus on, so this is kind of a crux of multiple studies that we conducted for many European players, many North American players who are already active in the market. As we saw that, some of these markets are much more advanced. And I wanted to highlight some of the key issues that they have faced in the recent past. And I read this somewhere, and I love this, that range anxiety could turn into charging anxiety. I think that's what happened the last year or so, specifically in US, where it used to be that we need to have enough chargers in place to make sure that there is no range anxiety, but if you have a lot of chargers in place, but you have reliability issues, then there is charging anxiety. I see a charger, but will I be able to charge from that charging post or not? So that range anxiety now kind of shifts towards a different problem, that is charging anxiety. A range of challenges that the mature markets have been facing, and it's extremely important that we take notes from these mistakes and roadblocks and challenges that they have faced to make sure that as the momentum builds in this region, we can treat them as lessons and not to repeat the mistakes when this momentum kind of takes things forward in this region. Lack of standardization, it's an age-old problem for EV charging infrastructure, non-customer friendly infrastructure. I'll definitely talk more about this in detail. Reliability, we had some discussions already with the last couple of days that reliability is of paramount importance. We just had a discussion about 99%, 97%. What's the benchmark? What's the goal for us? Having enough capacity, again, we had some discussions about that as well. I'd like to focus on this aspect too. Inefficient charging network, having it put in place in a way that you have more utilization, because it's at the end of the day, it's a business for charge point operators. Are they able to make enough money out of it? Is the charging infrastructure fully being utilized or not? Special use cases, I think that's another important learning. For example, multi-dwelling homes, charging infrastructure for them, people who do not have a charging space for themselves, so, how do they charge their vehicles? We talked about the difference, not being able to achieve the price parity between EVs and ICEs, and then high cost of infrastructure. I'll talk about these one by one in detail. Standardization of infrastructure was a major issue a lot of the mature markets faced, and even to this date, there are issues. The other day, we had a discussion where somebody discussed that even in UAE, there are issues in terms of battery swapping and not having a standardized method. And that really makes a big difference. For example, in the US, there was a big debate between the NAC standard, which is a standard set by Tesla, J3400, so that it's more well-known in the industry as J3400, versus the CCS connector. Many vehicles do not have the possibility right now, but then last year, somewhere around May, basically all the major automotive manufacturers announced that they will go NACs. And the reason for that is actually linked with the third point, which is reliability. Hands down, Tesla's network was much, much more reliable than any other network in the US. So right now, vehicles can charge, non-Tesla vehicles can charge from Tesla network through an adapter. Tesla is putting chargers which already have this magic dock, which allows cars with CCS connector to charge with NACs. From next year, we'll have vehicles in the US with NACs connector. So things are moving towards standardization, but it was a learning process. Previously, it used to be char demo versus CCS, and then of course, NACs came in as well. So that was a big hurdle in terms of having a standardized equipment. The other examples as well, when Tesla opened its network for non-Tesla vehicles, one of the big issues was the cable length was not enough, because the charging ports for non-Tesla vehicles was on the other side. How do you do that? Then you basically park your car in a way that you're basically occupying 2 parking spots. So the person next to you cannot charge because the charging cord or the cable is not long enough. So these kind of issues then started arising. So I think having standards put in place is extremely important. Now we see, there is great work being done by CharIN. Megawatt charging is something which is being developed. So having standards in place is extremely important. I think the charging community solved this standardization on the communication side very early, which was extremely important. Otherwise, it would have been a disaster had there been no standard in terms of communication. Customer-friendly infrastructure. That's a big pain point, or has been a big pain point in EU, in Europe. Non-uniform payment systems. How do you pay if there is, you have to subscribe to the network? How do you pay when you're going outside the country? If you, I don't know, from Germany to Austria, how do you pay if you're trying to charge from a different network? So many different charging methods. Lack of transparency in terms of pricing was a big issue. So this regulation, which just came in force last month, start of last month, was in the making for the last 2 years, AFIR. So it's a regulation now, it's binding for the member states in EU. EU Commission was behind it. A lot of debate went into this, and that has led into the region focusing on, or making sure that it's a customer-friendly infrastructure. For example, the non-transparent pricing was a big issue. Actually, a solution that I heard that the solution that they have now is also kind of failing. The solution was to have a QR code to make sure that any customer could just scan it, know all the specifications of the charger, including, by the way, charging capacity. That's a big issue. You would never think that, hey, charging capacity, the charger says 200 kilowatt. Does it provide 200 kilowatt? No, because it depends on the voltage of what's happening within the vehicle. It depends on that. Do you have an 800 volt vehicle or not? Because a lot of the times a charger manufacturer would say it's a 200, 350 kilowatt charger. To this date, there is no vehicle in the world, passenger vehicle, which can charge a 360 kilowatt. No, even though you'd see charging piles say 360 kilowatt, because it depends on how the vehicle is constructed. The customers felt that they were being deceived, that, yeah, you're going to get much better charging experience. So the solution was to put a QR code. The discussion was to either have a dynamic QR code within the screen when somebody, is charging, or to actually put a permanent, QR code. And then I heard that people have started putting fake QR codes on top of it. You scan and then you lose your personal information. So the issues happening there. So having a customer-friendly infrastructure is extremely important. Availability. So a lot of platforms actually inform you about the availability of the chargers, that, hey, this charger is going through maintenance or available. In many cases, that was not true. Whenever somebody would go to a charger, it would not be true that the charger is available. Reliability is extremely important topic. As I discussed, that it's a big issue in the US. Pretty much every charge point operator other than Tesla failed in terms of having a reliable network. It's a big pain point, and that's the reason why NACS was so successful. It was, everybody wanted to go NACS basically because of the reliability. It was 99%, audited by third parties as well. For Tesla, it was 99%. What happened last month or in the last few days with Tesla, of course, it adds a different dimension to this discussion altogether. So yeah, having reliability. There are like other questions. The charger is going through maintenance. How do you treat that? Do you treat that as downtime? Vandalism. How do you treat that? Let's say a charger is installed in an area where there's a bigger chance of vandalism. Do you say that it's CPO's responsibility, the charger is down? So there's a big discussion. Having reliable charging infrastructure is extremely important. In this region, the ambient conditions really make a big difference. These big DC chargers that we see outside, these are really heat-emitting devices. They need to have extremely good cooling mechanisms. So how does the ambient condition affect this? This needs to be studied in depth. Connectivity of the chargers can be lost, and the chargers can be down. Even if it's energized, you can't charge. So all of that results into having an unreliable charging experience for the customers. So I think that's a very important lesson, that when we are looking at this momentum kind of gathering in this region, we address these issues, we learn from these lessons. As I discussed earlier, that having enough capacity in the grid is also a big challenge. One of the challenges right now, many projects, EV charging projects in Europe, especially North America facing, is not something that one anticipated, and that is the transformer. So there needs to be a transformer behind the charger, because these are massive devices in terms of these power-hungry devices. We're talking about 300 kilowatt. You add 10 of them, you're looking at 3 megawatt of load. You can't have it without having enough capacity at the back end. The other day, in one of the panel discussions, we heard that somebody wanted to have just 2 chargers of 350 kilowatt. They thought it's not a big deal. They just could not get enough capacity. So yeah, transformer is a big issue in the US. You cannot, a lot of projects are being delayed. So chargers are in place. There is no transformer at the back end. So kind of securing the supply chain of everything that goes in, not just the chargers, also makes a big difference. Having enough capacity is going to be a crucial topic. There are other solutions. There are alternatives such as storage coupled with EV charging. So that is being discussed as well as an alternative to make sure that there is always enough capacity or enough buffer when you're installing fast charging network. Maximizing EVCI network efficiency. So a lot of the incentives, a lot of the initiatives that I talked about on slide 2 on a global level, they are ensuring that at least the main arteries of the transport infrastructure of every country, they are being addressed, especially for the long distance travel. So for example, the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, has this NEVI plan in the US. So that really focuses on the first part is on the reliability, but also ensuring that the main arteries of US's road infrastructure, they are being covered. So there are like a regulation that if you want this grant, you need to make sure that the charger that you're putting is not this many kilometers away from interstate, for example. So these are the regulations. Same is true for AFIR, that you need to make sure there is a 10T core network in Europe and there is a 10T comprehensive network. So it enforces you to then put your chargers near those main arteries. And again, the idea is to make sure that the entire network is designed in a way that you're not putting a charger in a place where there's not enough footfall, for example. At the end of the day, it's not the business model does not work for the CPU as well, because they are reselling the electricity. Multi-dwelling housing units, that's a very important, I think it's less discussed, but very crucial topic, especially in Europe, where not a lot of people have their parking spaces where they can charge their car. Multi-dwelling housing units, having enough charging infrastructure is extremely important. How do you go about this with the existing infrastructure? Again, not enough capacity, not enough parking spaces to ensure that. Like some nuanced cases, for example, Germany is notorious for having really bad cellular connection, for example. There's a joke that if you are actually entering from a different country, without looking outside, you can see from your cellular network if it's bad reception, you know that you've entered Germany. How do you ensure cellular connection 2 levels down in the parking if there is a charger installed? If it's GSM connected, how do you ensure that? So I think that's another area which needs to be really carefully looked at, especially in the region, because for the mass adoption of EVs, this is an area which definitely needs to be discussed and addressed in detail. Last 2 points, there's been a lot of discussion about the price parity. We talked a lot about having incentives in place. IRA in the US is a big incentive which is doing that. With a lot of restrictions, with a lot of recent modifications actually, because at the same time, as the goal is to reduce the difference between ICEs and EVs, there is another goal to make sure that EVs are assembled and manufactured within the US, so there is some auxiliary benefits that the country wants to achieve as well. And lastly, incentivizing the public EVCI infrastructure installation. It's like the cost of infrastructure is still high. To again have that momentum injected from the outside is going to be really crucial. All right, quickly summarizing the entire discussion. On the left-hand side, we see all the factors which basically focus on the infrastructure reliability, having the infrastructure in place which is customer-friendly. And again, the goal is to make sure that range anxiety does not turn into charging anxiety. That's all from my side. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please go ahead.
Thank you for this presentation. It was really helpful. Slide number 9, please. Regarding these strategies, I would like to understand the source of these strategies.
It's all publicly available government sources. I can share the sources with you. It's all publicly available.
How can we connect to share this?
Yes, I can share my details with you, and I can share this presentation along with the sources, because the sources are actually embedded in this presentation as well. So I can share the sources.
Perfect, thank you.
My contact information is not here. I'll definitely connect with you. Okay, perfect. Thank you.